This is part two of the lecture, Voting and Presidential Elections. Professor Peterson will talk about the primary contest first. How are delegates to the National Convention selected? And what are the differences between caucus and primary?
So there's two ways, at least, to be chosen to go to the National Convention. And one is to be elected as a delegate in a primary election. And the other way is to be elected a delegate in a caucus election. Now there is another way, and that is to become a superdelegate, which means you have to be a member of Congress or a governor or somebody who has a prominent position that automatically makes you part of the National Convention. The National Convention is going to decide who it is that's going to be the presidential candidate of the political party. And the rules differ between Republicans and Democrats, and I'm going to pass over a lot of those details because we could spend a whole course on nothing but that. But the primary point of this slide is to stress the fact that some delegates are elected in primaries and some are elected in caucuses. Now, what's the difference? Well, it's really a matter of time. We've talked about the importance of people's time and the fact that when you vote, it's taking your time. Well, if you vote in a caucus, it's going to take even more of your time. Let us take the Iowa caucuses, the most famous caucuses that we have in our presidential election campaigns. If you live in Iowa and you want to vote in the caucuses that are going to choose the delegates that are going to go to the National Convention, you have to show up at about 8 o'clock in the evening, and you might be there until midnight before your vote is cast, given all the steps and processes that they have to go through. Well, of course, in a primary election, you just go to your voting booth and you cast your vote, and hopefully you're home in 15 minutes. If it's a long line you have to wait in, it might take 25 minutes. But on the whole, you can be much more efficient in participation in a primary election than in a caucus election. So what does that mean? That means that you'll have many, many more people participating in primary elections, and you'll have many fewer people in caucuses. Now, who participates in a caucus? Well, somebody who's really passionate. Now, all primary elections, all caucus elections have the passionate members of a political party. The independents are much less likely to participate. So it's not like everybody in a political party participates in its primary. Only a small percentage participate in the primaries, but it's a tiny percentage that are going to participate in the caucuses. And then you have these superdelegates, as I mentioned, who go to the convention to try to play a moderating force so that some extremist doesn't come to power.
How did the difference between caucus and primary systems that we just talked about affect the outcome of the 2008 Democratic nomination contest?
Well, this was the battle between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. It was one of the most competitive primary battles in recent years. And neither candidate got a simple majority in the primary and caucus states. It was the superdelegates who, in the end, decided it. But the battle in the primary states was very, very even, with Clinton and Obama just about splitting the vote evenly between them. In the caucus states, Obama did much better than Clinton at mobilizing support. So Obama wins more delegates to the National Convention mainly because he was better organized in the caucus states and because he was the more extreme candidate. Clinton was identified with a government in power, the Clinton administration, which had necessarily made plenty of compromises. And she was the mainstream candidate. She was the party favorite. Obama came out of nowhere. He upset the mainstream candidate. Why? Because he appealed to activists and extremists who have particular power within a political party in a caucus situation. And there you can see the Super Tuesday states. And on Super Tuesday, Clinton wins most of the primaries, but Obama wins all of the caucuses. And on Super Tuesday, everybody knows that Barack Obama is going to be the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party. And he does it by capturing such unbelievable places as Idaho and Kansas, New Mexico, North Dakota, Alaska. How can Barack Obama be winning an election and mobilize in such strange places as that? Only the caucus system allowed him to do that.
How do voters in primary contests compare to those in general elections?
Well, as caucus voters are to primary voters are to general election voters. In other words, in general elections, if you imagine that the American public is pretty moderate and most of their opinions are right in the middle of the spectrum. You see this big red bulge in the middle? Well, most people are in the middle. We've talked about that before in our public opinion lecture. Most people are in the middle. You've got some extremists out on the left and you got some extremists out on the right. Now, if you're in a primary election, only half the population is really going to be interested in that. The Republicans are going to be interested in their primary and the Democrats are going to be interested in theirs. So that means that the winner of the primary is going to need to capture the range of votes from the middle out. Now, that means they're going to have to adopt positions that are much more extreme than those positions that are going to get the majority in the general election. So in the general election, you want to be a moderate candidate. You want to be moving to the middle. In the primary elections, you want to be out on the extreme. So every candidate, Romney is a good example. In the primary elections of 2012, he had to run against very conservative Republicans, and he himself had to present himself as a strong conservative. All of a sudden, that becomes a problem, and he has to become a very moderate Republican if he's going to have a chance of beating the incumbent president. Well, he doesn't win, but he does get pretty close. And in the meantime, he shifts his position on the issues pretty dramatically to the middle. Now, that's not just Romney. That's going to happen time and time again in American politics because the primary voters are very different from those who vote in the general election.
What is momentum? Does the candidate that gets it win the nomination?
Well, momentum theory says if you only could win in Iowa, that first caucus state, or if only you could win in New Hampshire, that first primary state, you can get the news coverage that you're going to need to mobilize public opinion, because most people don't pay much attention to anything and they like a winner. So if you can win that first state, you can somehow win the whole thing. So that leads people to spend enormous sums of money, even before the first caucus state, even before Iowa. So here we are now in 2013, and there's already plans to organize campaigns because you've got to be organized by 2014 because in 2015 you're going to have the invisible primaries, all the little fundraising activities and special events that you've got to show that you've got some base that's going to support you. So unless you get started very early and win those invisible primaries, you're not going to win that Iowa caucus and that New Hampshire primary. So momentum theory says you got to get started early, and if you win the early battles, you win the late ones. Now, is that true? Well, does the person who wins the Iowa caucus win it all? Well, I don't know. Who wins the Iowa caucus? This is what happens on the Republican side. It's not fair to talk about this when you have incumbents, because the incumbent will generally be the person who will be the leader of the party in the next election. That happens every single time. But so it really counts only when it's the party out of power that's trying to settle on the new candidate, the new leader of their party. And you can see that for the Republicans, 4 times out of 6, who won the Iowa caucuses lost the nomination. And among Democrats, it's more likely to be true, but still it's not a universal truth. There were a couple of times where they didn't. And much the same is true of the New Hampshire primary.
Why are primary contests hard to predict well in advance?
Well, for one thing, you don't have any cues as to who to vote for based on their party identification. If you're a Democrat voting in a Democratic primary, every candidate's a Democrat. So you're going to vote for a Democrat for sure. Well, but which Democrat? And they all sound the same. They all pretty much take the same position on the issues. Maybe there's some distinctions that you can draw, but they're going to tend to look a lot alike because they're all going to go to that median voter. They're all going to be at the median of the primary voter. So without the party ID, without the issues, then it becomes more of a personality game than anything else. And people have real personalities, and then they have political personalities. And their political personalities may be completely different from their real personalities, and they may be distorted by the media. And you never know exactly how that's going to happen in the course of a campaign. And that's why these are really difficult. Anybody who thinks they can predict the outcome of the next nominating process in the two political parties for the presidency, well, if they can do that, if they got that crystal ball, they can make a lot of money. Well, here's an example of the Iowa caucuses that I'm going to leave you to explore, and I'll let you hear the decision that LBJ announced when he was not going to run for re-election in the Democratic primary process in 1968. So these are two interesting ways of thinking about caucuses and primaries historically.
I'm in Des Moines, Iowa, at Brody High School, the site of the 67th precinct for caucusing. We're in the Democratic caucus, and around the room are different groups representing the supporters for each Democratic candidate.
All right, everybody hands up. We'll go this way, we'll do the bleachers, and then we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
I'm a John Edwards supporter.
And what are you doing to make sure that these Biden people come over to John Edwards?
People I know, I'm going to talk to each one of them, convince them John Edwards is the right man for president. We're going to get him over here.
Hillary Clinton supporters?
Yeah. Yes.
What are you doing to make sure the Biden people come over to Hillary?
Kidnapping most of them. You know what, a lot of times chloroform, when you knock them out, you can drag them over. By the time they wake up, they don't know where they're at.
And what's your particular tactic?
You know, just friends, invite them over, bribes, whatever it takes.
What kind of bribes?
Whatever it takes. Free drinks after a little dinner.
Has it worked yet?
You know, a little bit, yeah.
Caucuses like this one have taken place in over 1,700 precincts around Iowa tonight, and they will be held in 13 states as this primary season continues.
With America's sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.